I need to check the list of used names first, then write the story. The band names from the file include Martin, Derek, Paul, Phil, Gary, Tom, Craig, Spencer, Howard, Nathan, Cole, Vincent, Rebecca, Sandra, Drew, Brendan, Felix, Claudia, Cassandra, Elliot, Arthur Weston, Hiroko, Linda, Warren, Jasper, Meredith, Catherine, Ray, Owen Schraft, Cooper, Callie, Henderson, Marcus, Dominic, Gerald, Nora, Dwight, Kellerman, Kowalski, Trent, Reginald, Hal, Brent, Calloway, Fitch, Theo, Rhett, Alden, Sylvia, Walter, Everett, Stanton, Lowell, Priya, Vic Russo, Kevin, Amber, Patty, Roland, Pierso, Kevin, Amber, Patty, Roland, Pierce, Lorraine, Diane, Aldrich, Preston, Miles, Garrett, Eli Sutton, Hargrove, Cliff, Norman, Zane, Gareth. New names I'll use: narrator, I, Whitfield, COO, Osgood, HR Director, Renata, attorney, my wife, my son. Hi, Cov, Berdoikim Prath, Monsrimes, Operations Director, Drake 2E, Commenter Wheatla, Matmanites, Wedding out Bon FFRinitsen, Berdowitum, Fortu E, Badin Kambao Even, Thintam Furkopam Afen, a want fa thing vef efi, Frequatism of vivro, Afen, Tyke free, found thing vidi, Vida fi, Figambao, so wait feed, Fido. Figaway, Dava, Ficken, Bikal, Bidig, Biga, Tech, to wear Bigam, Projecturing, Protectigant, Pagan, Figam, Tway, the Gats, the Gabi. I want you to sit with that number for a second, not skim past it the way you do with numbers in a news article. 24 years. That's longer than my son has been alive. That's the span of time between when I had dark hair and when I didn't. When I walked into Caldwell Industrial the first time, I was 31 years old, wearing a suit I'd bought on sale at a department store because I didn't own a good one yet. I parked in the visitor lot because I didn't have a badge. By the time his story ends, I had rebuilt their entire supply chain from the ground up twice, and the badge I carried said Senior Director of Operations. I'm telling you this not to impress you. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand what 24 years feels like from the inside. It doesn't feel like loyalty. It feels like identity. The company stops being a place you go and starts being a thing you are. I knew which elevator was slowest. I knew that the second floor HVAC unit ran cold in February and that the guys in receiving kept a space heater under the desk they weren't supposed to have. I knew the quarterly rhythm of the business better than I knew the rhythm of my own household. My wife used to joke that I could tell her our procurement cycle variance to 3 decimal points, but forgot our anniversary twice. She wasn't entirely wrong. I started in logistics coordination, moved up to regional ops manager inside 4 years, which at the time felt fast, then spent the next decade in the director chair, running a team that at its peak was 62 people across 3 facilities. In 2019, when the company was bleeding cash on a warehouse routing system that had been cobbled together by 3 different vendors over 15 years, I proposed building something in-house, not off the shelf, not another vendor contract, a proprietary routing and inventory reconciliation platform built specifically for our operational footprint, maintained internally, owned by the people who understood the work. My VP at the time, a man I genuinely respected, took the proposal to the board. They approved it. They gave me a team of 5 and a timeline of 18 months. We delivered in 14. The system, I called it the CREO platform internally, stood for Consolidated Routing and Inventory Operations, cut our fulfillment error rate by 31% in the first year. Saved the company an amount of money I will not name here. But it was significant enough that I received a personal email from the CEO. Not from his assistant. From him. 4 lines. Direct. The last line said, "You built something that will outlast both of us here." I printed that email. It's in a drawer at my house. I looked at it again recently. The trouble started, as it often does, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a new hire. His name was Whitfield. He came in as COO in the spring of my 23rd year at the company, brought in by the board after our longtime COO retired. Whitfield was 50, polished, had spent 15 years at a consulting firm restructuring mid-size manufacturers. He had the vocabulary of a person who had read every leadership book published since 2005. Operational synergy, lean transformation, right-sizing the human capital footprint. I heard those phrases inside the first week. I made a note to myself, not written down, just filed. He was cordial to me. I want to be accurate about that. He wasn't rude. He wasn't cold. He shook my hand, said he'd heard about the CRIO build, said it was impressive. He asked if I'd walk him through it sometime. I did. Spent 2 hours with him in the server room annex going through the architecture, the logic, the maintenance protocols. He nodded in the right places, asked reasonably intelligent questions. I left that meeting thinking, okay, this might work. It took about 8 months to understand what was actually happening. The VP of Operations role had been vacant for 2 years. Everyone assumed it was mine. I had been functionally doing the job, reporting to the COO, managing cross-facility alignment, sitting in on board ops reviews. My direct reports assumed it. My peers assumed it. Frankly, I assumed it. There had been conversations, nothing in writing but conversations. The kind where a person in authority says when this formalizes instead of if. That's a specific word choice. You notice it. In November, I got called into a meeting with Whitfield and Osgood, who ran HR. I sat down. There was a folder on the table. Osgood slid it toward me. The VP role had been filled. Externally. A woman named, and I will be fair here, she was competent, who had come out of an automotive supply chain background, started in January. I looked at Whitfield. He looked back at me with the expression of a man who had practiced looking back at people in moments like this. Measured, composed. He said the board had decided to bring in external perspective for the VP level. He said my work was valued. He used the word foundational. He said my role would evolve to support the new VP in a transition capacity. I asked what transition capacity meant. He said, we're still defining the scope. I nodded. I thanked them for telling me directly. I stood up, shook Whitfield's hand, walked back to my office, closed the door, and sat very still for a long time. My wife called that evening. I was still at the office. She asked how my day was. I said it was fine. I didn't tell her yet. I needed a night to process it before I could put words to it without sounding like a person who had lost all perspective. I hadn't lost perspective, but I was close. The next 6 months were what I can only describe as a managed erasure. Gradual enough that each individual step seemed reasonable, cumulative enough that the destination was obvious. The new VP arrived and I was assigned to brief her on CRO, which I did, thoroughly, professionally. Then I was assigned to document all operational processes in a standardized format for a knowledge repository, which, if you've been in this position, you will recognize. They were asking me to package everything I knew into a format someone else could use. Then I was moved off the board ops review distribution list. Then my team was realigned to report to the new VP directly, with me retained in a senior advisory capacity. Then, in April, I received a formal notice that my position was being eliminated in a restructuring effective 60 days from that date. The severance offer was 12 weeks of pay. 12 weeks. For 24 years. I didn't react in the meeting. I took the paperwork, thanked Osgood for her time, and I will say she had the decency to look uncomfortable, and I drove home. I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. My son was doing homework at the kitchen table. My wife was making dinner. It was so ordinary. The most ordinary evening, and I had just been handed the end of something that had been my life for longer than my son had been alive. I called my attorney the next morning. She had done some contract work for me years ago on a property matter, and I trusted her. I told her the situation. She asked me to send her everything. My original employment agreement, the subsequent amendments, the documentation around the CRI project, the emails, the restructuring notice, everything. 3 days later, she called me back. She was quiet for a moment before she spoke, which I had learned meant she was choosing her words. She said, "Did you know about the IP clause in your 2019 project authorization agreement?" I said, "Tell me what you're seeing." She told me. In 2019, when the board approved the CRIO platform build, there had been an authorization agreement signed between myself and the company. Standard stuff mostly, scope of work, timeline, budget parameters. But in the Appendix D, specifically, there was a clause that had been included at my attorney's suggestion during an earlier contract renegotiation. I had honestly not thought about it in years. The clause stated that in the event of involuntary separation without cause, any proprietary systems developed under my direct technical leadership and bearing my documented authorship would require a formal licensing arrangement for continued operational use. with terms to be negotiated within 30 days of separation, and that absent such an agreement, operational access would be subject to restriction pending resolution. She let that sit for a moment. I said, "And CRIO qualifies." She said, "CRIO absolutely qualifies. You have documentation of authorship going back to the proposal stage. You have development logs with your name as lead architect. You have the original codebase commits. You built that system. The company has been operating it for 5 years, and if they separate you without cause, which a restructuring technically is, they need a licensing agreement with you, or they need to stop using it." I asked her what she thought CRIO was worth as a licensing asset. She said she'd need to consult with a tech valuation contact, but her initial read was significant. The platform was processing somewhere between $40 and $60 million in inventory movement annually. Custom built. No off-the-shelf equivalent. Replacement cost alone was substantial. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter than both of those. Something closer to clarity. For 6 months I had been watching something being taken from me piece by piece, and I had told myself to stay professional, stay measured, don't make it personal. And I had. I had done exactly that, and it hadn't changed anything. The outcome was the same. They had made the decision about me before I walked into any of those meetings. The meetings were just the paperwork. So I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time. I decided to read the fine print. My attorney sent a formal notice to Caldwell Industrial's legal counsel 11 days before my separation date. The notice was precise. It cited Appendix D of the 2019 Project Authorization Agreement by section and subsection. It identified CRIO by name, by development timeline, by documented authorship. It stated that as of my involuntary separation, continued operational use of the platform without a licensing agreement would constitute a breach of contract. It requested a response within 7 business days. I did not tell Whitfield. I did not tell Osgood. I did not tell the new VP, who by this point had been running operations for 4 months using a system she had been briefed on, but did not understand at an architectural level. I went about my final days in the office the same way I had gone about every other day. Showed up, was professional, answered questions, said goodbye to people I genuinely liked. On my last day, a Friday, I cleared my desk, returned my badge, and drove home. My wife had made dinner. She opened a bottle of wine she'd been saving. We sat on the back porch and watched the sun go down, and she held my hand and didn't say anything for a while, which is one of the things I love most about her. She always knows when words are the wrong tool. I told her what I'd done. Not in detail, just the outline. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long do you think before they call?" I said, "Honestly, I give it a week." It was 9 days. What happened in those 9 days I learned later, partly from my attorney and partly from a former colleague who was still inside and who I will not name here. What happened was this. CRIO had a session authentication layer that was tied to an administrative credential structure. Every platform does. The difference with CRI was that the master administrative access, the level above IT's standard management access, had been set up under my credentials during the build phase and had never been formally transitioned. Because no one had ever thought it would need to be. I was never supposed to leave. That was the implicit assumption baked into every decision about how that system was maintained. When my access was terminated on separation, as it automatically was, the master admin layer locked. CRIO didn't go down. I want to be clear about that. I did not sabotage anything. I did not touch a single line of code after my last day. I didn't need to. The system simply could not be updated, modified, or have its routing tables adjusted without master admin access, and the routing tables needed adjustment every week. Fulfillment patterns changed. Inventory categories shifted. Without those adjustments, errors began accumulating. Slowly at first, then faster. By day 5, the fulfillment error rate had climbed noticeably. By day 7, 2 of their largest wholesale accounts had called to complain about shipment discrepancies. By day 9, the operations floor was in controlled chaos, and IT had escalated to Whitfield that they could not resolve the access issue internally. The system had been built with a specific architecture. That architecture required a specific person to unlock it. That person no longer worked there. The call came from Osgood, which I thought was interesting. Not Whitfield. Osgood. She was professional and brief. She said the company wanted to discuss the situation and asked if I was available to speak with their legal team. I gave the phone to my attorney. The conversation my attorney had with their legal team lasted about 40 minutes. She called me afterward and described it the way she sometimes describes things, with a very measured voice that I had learned means she is trying not to sound like she is enjoying herself. Their position initially was that my credentials were company property and that the access issue was an IT matter, not a contractual one. My attorney referred them to Appendix D and reminded them that the notice had been sent 11 days prior and had received no response within the 7-business-day window, which in itself constituted an acknowledgement of the breach. Their legal team asked for time to review. She gave them 48 hours. When they came back, the tone had changed. They wanted to know what a licensing arrangement would look like. My attorney had been working on that. She had a tech valuation contact who had done a rapid analysis based on the platform documentation I'd provided. CRIO was valued, conservatively, at between $400,000 and $600,000 as a licensing asset given its operational scope and replacement cost. The licensing proposal was structured as a lump sum buyout, meaning the company would pay a one-time fee to obtain full ownership of the platform, all documentation, and a formal knowledge transfer. The alternative was an ongoing annual licensing fee, which over a 5-year horizon would cost them more. The lump sum number my attorney proposed was $480,000. I need to tell you what I was doing when she called to give me that number. I was in the garage fixing a section of trim on my son's bookshelf that had been loose for about 3 months. I'd been meaning to get to it. My son had mentioned it twice and I'd said I'll get to it and then not gotten to it, the way you do when you're working 60 hours a week and the small things at home feel like they'll always be there. I had time now. I was in the garage with wood glue and a clamp and a piece of sandpaper, and my phone rang and she told me the number. I set down the sandpaper. She said, "That's their opening position. I think we can hold." I said, "Hold." We held. 3 days later, they came back at $480,000. Full ask, no counter. Their legal team had apparently run their own analysis and determined that the ongoing licensing structure was a worse outcome. They wanted clean ownership. They wanted it resolved. There was a condition attached from my side. In addition to the payment, I required a formal acknowledgement in the settlement agreement that the CRIO platform had been developed under my leadership and with my original authorship, not for vanity, because I wanted it documented. Somewhere in writing, attached to a legal instrument, it would say, "This person built this." They agreed. The settlement agreement was signed on a Wednesday morning. I read every word of it myself before my attorney and I both signed. My attorney had flagged one clause related to non-disparagement that she wanted softened, and they agreed to the modification. Everything else went through as written. The wire transfer cleared 4 business days later, $480,000. My wife and I went out to dinner that night. Not anywhere fancy, a place we've gone for years. A family-owned Italian restaurant about 15 minutes from our house where they know our names and the bread comes out hot and there's no reason to go anywhere else. We got a booth in the back and ordered things we'd had 100 times, and she had a glass of wine and I had a beer, and we talked about normal things. Our son's college applications, whether we should repaint the guest room, a trip we'd been putting off to see her sister. At some point she asked me how I felt. I thought about it for a minute. I wasn't sure I had the right word. I said something like, settled. Not victorious. Not vindicated, exactly. Settled. Like a thing that had been off balance for a long time had finally returned to level. She nodded like she understood that. She usually does. I've thought about what I would say to someone who found themselves in a version of my situation. Not the specifics. Every situation is different, but the principle underneath it. What I came back to was something my father told me when I was young and just starting out, before I understood what it meant. He said, "Always know what you built. Know it by name. Know what it cost you. Because someday someone will try to walk away with it and pretend it was always theirs." I didn't fully understand that when he said it. I understand it now. The CRIO platform is still running at Caldwell Industrial. I know this because my former colleague mentioned it in passing, not in a gloating way, just factually. It runs under their full ownership now, which is as it should be. They paid for it, properly this time. I got a call 6 weeks after the settlement from someone at the company, not Whitfield, not Osgood, someone from the board level, asking if I would be interested in a consulting arrangement to support a planned expansion of the platform to 2 additional facilities. Short term, my rate, my terms. I told him I'd think about it. My attorney said, take the meeting, see what they offer. My wife said, do whatever makes you feel right, not what makes you feel right now. My son, who is 18 and does not yet fully understand how any of this works, said, Dad, make them pay double. I liked all 3 pieces of advice. I took the meeting. The terms they offered were reasonable. I negotiated them to terms that were better. I agreed to a 6-month consulting engagement at a rate I set. The engagement has since concluded. I will not say how much it was worth. I will say that the guest room has been repainted, the trip to see my wife's sister happened, and the bookshelf in my son's room has been solid and level for quite some time now. There's one more thing I want to say, and I'll say it plainly. I wasn't angry for most of this. I know that sounds hard to believe. People hear a story like this, and they assume the whole thing ran on rage, on wounded pride, on wanting to watch someone suffer. It wasn't like that. By the time my attorney sent that first notice, the anger had already passed through me and left something colder and cleaner behind. What drove those 11 days of silence, the decision to let the notice speak instead of me, the patience to wait 9 days without reaching out, that wasn't anger. That was 24 years of learning how things work, how documentation matters, how the details other people skip over are exactly the details that protect you. How the most powerful thing you can do in a room where someone holds all the apparent leverage is to already know what you know before you walk in. I read every contract I've ever signed. I've read them carefully since I was in my 30s, and a mentor told me that the most important words in any agreement are the ones in the appendix that nobody reads. I passed that on to my son last year. I told him, before you sign anything, read the appendix. Read the parts that feel like formality. Read the parts that seem like they could never matter. Because the day they matter completely. He rolled his eyes a little. He's 18. He'll understand someday. I've turned this whole thing over in my mind more times than I can count. Not obsessively. Just the way you do when something big happens and you're trying to understand what it actually means, underneath all the paperwork and the wire transfers and the settlement language. Here's what I keep coming back to. Whitfield didn't lose because he was cruel. He wasn't, particularly. He was calculating, which is a different thing. What he didn't account for was that I had spent 24 years paying attention, not just to the work itself, but to the details around the work, the agreements, the authorizations, the things people sign and then file away because they assume they'll never need them. I had read Appendix D in 2019 and understood what it meant, and then I'd gone back to building CRIO and hadn't thought about it again for years. But I had read it. That's the part that mattered. There's something I want to say about patience, because I think people misunderstand what patience actually is. It isn't passivity. It isn't accepting what's being done to you and hoping things get better. What I did in those final 6 months at that company, being professional, briefing my replacement, documenting processes, showing up every day without letting the anger out, that wasn't weakness. That was patience as a deliberate choice. I was watching, and I was waiting, and I was gathering everything I needed before I moved. A person who acts from pure emotion the moment they're hurt usually burns their leverage before they've even identified what it is. I didn't do that. I waited until I had spoken to my attorney. I waited until I understood exactly what I had. Then I moved once, and I moved in the right direction. I think about the conversation I had with my father years ago. The one I mentioned. He said, know what you built. Know it by name. Know what it cost you. I didn't fully understand that as a young man because I hadn't built anything yet that someone could take. Now I understand it completely. The CRIO platform cost me years of thinking, years of iteration, years of coming home late and staring at the ceiling running routing logic in my head before I fell asleep. That cost was real. The clause in Appendix D was simply the formal acknowledgement of that cost. I hadn't put it there to trap anyone. I had put it there because my attorney said it was reasonable and I agreed. The fact that it became necessary was Whitfield's decision, not mine. What this whole thing taught me, and I mean this practically, not philosophically, is that integrity and intelligence are not separate qualities. A lot of people treat them like their intention, like you can be principled or you can be smart about protecting yourself, but not both at once. That's wrong. The most powerful thing I did throughout this entire situation was behave with complete integrity while understanding exactly what my rights were. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't make speeches. I sent a formal notice citing a specific clause in a specific appendix of a specific agreement. That's it. The intelligence was in knowing what I had. The integrity was in how I used it. My son is 18. He's going out into a world where the terms of things, employment, contracts, agreements, relationships will be set by people who assume he isn't reading carefully. My advice to him and to anyone who's been in a version of what I went through is simple. Read carefully. Document what you build. Know the names of the things you create. And when someone tries to walk away with what's yours while telling you to be grateful for 12 weeks of severance, don't raise your voice. Just open Appendix D.